So now it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Adam Garfinkle. Adam Garfinkle, the editor of The American Interest. Can everyone see his photo on the cover? No. Adam Garfinkle, founder and editor of The American Interest. Before founding that in 2005, he served in 2003 and to 2005 as the principal speechwriter to the Secretary of State. He has also been editor of The National Interest and has taught at the School for Advanced International Studies, at Johns Hopkins, at University of Pennsylvania, at Haverford College, and other institutions of higher learning. Dr. Garfinkle served as a member of the National Security Study Group, chief writer, and the U.S. Commission on National Security for the 21st Century, better known as the Hart-Rudman Commission. And he was an aide to Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. A widely published scholar, he's received awards and grants from the U.S. Department of State, Fulbright Fellowship, American Academy in Berlin, the German Marshall Fund, U.S. Institute of Peace, Moshe Dayan Center for the Study of Middle Eastern and African Affairs, and others. Dr. Garfinkle's second most recent book is entitled Jewcentricity, How the Jews Get Praised, Blamed, and Used to Explain Nearly Everything, and that's from 2009. His Telltale Hearts, The Origin and Impact of the Vietnam Anti-War Movement, was named a notable book in 1995 by the New York Times Book Review. His most recent work, his current work, is entitled Broken, American Political Dysfunction and What to Do About It. Dr. Garfinkle received his doctorate in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. And further, I'd like to add that Adam Garfinkle is a very engaging speaker. And he's one of our favorites, and of course, most importantly, he's had a strong working relationship with the Foreign Policy Research Institute for more than 20 years. And ask him lots of good, tough questions at the end. He's very dramatic and dynamic, and look forward to this. Adam?
Thank you. I used to be a dramatic speaker. I've toned it down a lot in recent years, so, you know, here it is. You've been hammered with lots of words this morning from Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Maurer, and now you've eaten lunch, and it's a cloudy day, and frankly, it's a great time to think about a nap. So I actually think that I'll be doing a great job if I can just keep you awake for a little while. I am not an historian by training. As you heard, my doctorate is in the social science. And I'm going to talk social science to you rather than history as such. And I think it might be useful to you anyway, because when you teach these subjects, how to go about them, what kind of methodology to choose, what kind of intellectual platform to use has to be a significant challenge for you, a significant question. And as much as I admire history and as much as I love history, and I've done some archival history myself, it's not the only way to go about these things. And when you have a limited amount of time to talk to students, it may not even be the most economical way to go about them. So when I was confronted with the topic that I was assigned, you know, the Middle East before the Arab Spring, I was struck by a combination of panic and ataxia. I mean, so my first question was, you mean the whole Middle East, all of it? And what do you mean by before the Arabs? You have a handout in your folder from my old friend Asher Susser, which tells you why Arab Spring is such a misleading label for what's been going on in some countries in the region over the past 3 years. I second that. It's a terrible label, and I'll explain why in a minute. How long before the Arab Spring? I mean, do you want me to take it back to the day after the Garden of Eden? You want me to take it back to Ottoman times? You want me to take it back to the formation of the modern state system right after World War I? Well, luckily, a lot of this has been covered already this morning, so I'm going to do it a slightly different way. Instead of moving from more remote times in history up to the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring 3 years ago, I'm actually going to go in the reverse direction. I think that'll be a little bit novel. And I'm only going to talk about the Arabs. I'm not going to talk about Iran or Turkey or Israel, just the Arabs, as if, you know, more than 20 countries isn't enough. let me now tell you, as I suggested I might, let me now tell you why the term Arab Spring struck me as so, when it was first coined, struck me as so wildly inappropriate. Americans, when they got wind of what was happening, first in Tunisia, and then spreading to Egypt, and then spreading to other countries in the region, not all of them, but many of them, Americans got excited. What did Americans see on the media? They saw a lot of angry people hanging out in Midan al-Tahrir, for example, in Cairo, and in other places, in Benghazi in Libya, and so forth. And what do Americans see when they see people out on the street protesting their government? Well, Americans tend to see a democracy movement. The assumption is that if people are angry at their governments in authoritarian political cultures, that what they're protesting about is a lack of procedural democracy as we understand what democracy is. Then, of course, not long after all the noise started, Hosni Mubarak fell from power in Egypt. And when he fell from power in Egypt, what did Americans typically think? If you listen to the language that the press used and that members of our political class used, it was regime change. The regime fell when Hosni Mubarak was no longer president of Egypt, and Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, Field Marshal Tantawi, became titular head of state, at least until the subsequent June when there was an election and Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was elected. And to somebody who is schooled in the Middle East, knows the area, but more important, somebody who understands the use of language, normal, proper English language, there were more, but these were two wild conflations of what should have been more careful distinctions. Remember, Arab societies have been ill-used by their leaderships for many, many years, some more than others, obviously. But the people who are out in the street in Midan al-Tahrir and other places had lots of good reasons to be upset with their leadership, but demanding democracy, as we understand the term, was a minority position. And I'll get to what they were upset about later. A lot of people made reference, for example, to the people power movement in the Philippines against the Marcoses, Imelda and all her shoes and all that. Well, it's hard to think of anything less like people power in the Philippines than what happened in Tunisia and later in Egypt and in Libya and in Syria and in Bahrain and elsewhere. And the idea that when Mubarak left, that was regime change was also just flat wrong. What happened was it was the end of a dynasty because Mubarak and his wife Suzanne were angling to pass on the leadership of an ailing 84 at the time, I think, to his son Gamal. But if you understand in normal political sociology terms what a regime is, when Mohammed Hussein Tantawi became head of state, that represented the continuity of the regime, not the change in the regime. Only a dynasty ended, not the regime. The way that Egypt worked between Mubarak and Tantawi was pretty much the same. The difference is that Mubarak, who was an Air Force general, generally walked around without a military uniform on, although Egypt was a military government, military bureaucracy. Whereas Tantawi, being a field marshal, walked around with his uniform on. But aside from the sartorial aspect, that was about the only difference. Now, there was a regime change in Egypt, and that was when Morsi was elected, and he pretty quickly dumped Tantawi and his senior group of military officers, and then tried to really dig deep down into the deep state of Egypt, the military bureaucracy, and tried to get rid of the rest of it, and eventually ran up against many barriers, some self-wrought, some not, and then, of course, in July, just this past July, General al-Sisi, in turn, unseated Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was a restoration of the original regime. Now, Americans, when they got wind of all of this change, all right, they thought, oh, this is it. This is a continuation of Samuel Huntington's third wave of democracy. And a lot of people really believed that before very long, all 22, depending on how you count, 22 Arab countries there'd be this demonstration effect, this kind of mousetrap collision of revolutionary fervor, and all of these countries, or many of these countries anyway, would turn into democracies. Or they would at least turn into plural polities, if not democracies. And of course, with that, you would get good governance, better governance anyway than authoritarian regimes, and you would get prosperity, and you would get peace within and among countries. This is the American way of thinking. This is our Enlightenment inheritance. This is the peace theory of democracy. This is the Tocquevillian view that democracies don't go, that democracies are pacific. They're not bellicose. They don't go to war with other democracies. So this was seen as almost by many people as the cusp of a new great age. That just like democracy rolled over Eastern and Central Europe with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then the Soviet Union, so in the Middle East this was a continuation of the democratic wave, and now this part of the world that it seemed so recalcitrant to democratic reform would finally become democracies. Now, this is what, I don't know if the majority of Americans thought this, but if you looked at the press and kind of you sort of follow the blogs, follow the comments, this was a dominant expectation. Guess what, folks? It didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. And anybody who, before all this stuff began, knew anything about the history and culture and political sociology of the region knew that all this was a bunch of cow flop, and this was not going to happen. Why? How? Okay. One of the problems that American political culture has when it deals with other people, like I mentioned, we are children of the Enlightenment, not just any Enlightenment, but a kind of a slightly I don't know, not lowest common, but a slightly denatured version of the Scottish Enlightenment, and we tend to think that democracy and capitalist economies fell out of the sky one day, and that they are the default drive of humanity. And that if there are countries in the world, there are societies in the world that are not democratic and that do not believe in market economics, the only reason for it has to be some sort of illness or some sort of artificial barrier. And if you simply remove the barrier, everybody will clatter around and the default drive will emerge and they will become democracies and they will become market economies. Well, this is very nice. This is a great definition of what anthropologists call a myth. In other words, I'm not using the word myth to say that this idea is literally false and it's a false story. I use the word myth in the technical social science sense of an account of causality that is beyond empirical validation. In other words, based on beliefs. They may be informed beliefs, they may be logically connected beliefs, but it is nevertheless a belief. It resembles a creedal principle. In other words, it resembles, in many cases, a religious belief. We don't call it that because it doesn't have anything to do with the religion that we're familiar with, but in terms of the logical syntax of how we think about these things, it pretty much boils down to a religious belief. In some American administrations, like the one that I happen to have served in, the George W. Bush administration, it came very close to an explicit, essentially religious or creedal belief that democracy is the default drive of all humanity, and so on and so forth. Now, why is this not so? Why is this difficult? Why did the Arab Spring, so-called, not appear to yield this kind of result? And by the way, this isn't the first time that we got excited and optimistic about changes in other parts of the world. You remember the color revolutions, right? You remember what people thought was going to happen in Ukraine, what people thought was going to happen in Georgia, what people thought was going to happen in Kyrgyzstan, and that wasn't that long ago. And you had the same sort of very high expectations of these political transformations. There was the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. We had chills went up the back of people's spine. Human rights and democracy was breaking out all over these countries. Well, that didn't work out so hot either. People have amazingly short memories. Only a couple of years after that kind of went slightly south, to one degree or another, along comes the Arab Spring and it starts all over again. I don't know why people can't seem to remember from one series of cases to the other, but I'll let you ponder how come it is that Americans just have this sort of a historical attention deficit problem almost constantly. I think one of the reasons that we tend to become a little bit untethered when we look at other parts of the world, we see these kinds of events, is that we project our own frames of reference onto other. We do it unwittingly, and we do it benignly most of the time. we project our own frames of reference onto other people whose historical experiences and whose political cultures are different from ours. Western culture, it took Western culture, it took, America as, the end point, from our point of view, of international best practice. It took hundreds of years through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Reformation to hew out the kinds of political institutions that we enjoy today, we in many Western countries. The Arab world has not had the same experiences. They did not go through the Italian Renaissance because it was in Italy. They did not go through a kind of Reformation. They did not experience the Enlightenment in the same way as the West. So why is it that people suppose that these very different historical predicates should produce the same kinds of political institutions? They obviously aren't going to do that. Now, when I said I was going to go backwards in history, let's just do a little thought experiment for a minute. Let's project ahead. Let's start from, again, what we know as political best practice. All right? And let me describe exactly what that means. A modern liberal democracy really consists of three balanced components. The first of these is a post-patrimonial state. Some of this language is going to be slightly challenging for some of you. If it is, just ask me in Q&A what the hell I'm talking about, and I'll try to tell you what I'm talking about. A post-patrimonial state, a Weberian state. I'm referring to Max Weber. What Weber explained is that modern states, executive authorities, are not the possession of a particular family. The dynastic principle in pre-modern cultures is that a state was essentially owned by a family. It was owned by the dynasty. It was owned by the ruler. And in many cases, everything appertaining to the state, including all the land, was also owned by the royal family. In the Russian case, the Russian Tsar, the Romanovs, literally owned all the land. Right? Of course, there are many variations of the pre-patrimonial setup, but Weber said that unless you have impersonal, formal authority, you don't have a modern executive, you don't have a modern state. So you have to have a modern state to be a modern liberal democracy. Second thing you have to have is rule of law. And in particular, you have to have the apex of rule of law, which is constitutional law. In other words, you have to have a circumstance in which law not only trumps men, but law trumps all men, including leaders, that the leaders of a polity are subject to the same law as everybody else. That's constitutional law, all right? A way of aligning the power of leadership with the power of law. And third, you need some form of accountability. Now, accountability can be of one of two types. It can be procedural accountability. In other words, electing people, majority rule. That's the way that modern democracies do it. But in theory, at least in history, there is also substantive accountability, which means that leaders can be held accountable to their subjects, their citizens, if they had that word at the time, not by any formal process, but by a process of negotiation and consensus building and essentially a kind of a continuous negotiation among elders of any given society. All right? Now, if that's what that roughly corresponds in the American way of government, that roughly corresponds to the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. Now, all modern polities have modern liberal democracies, liberal polities have a post-patrimonial state. They have rule of law of one kind or another, and they have accountability, usually procedural accountability in formal democracies. Okay? Here's the catch. Most Americans think that these three things, these three elements of a state, are pretty much the same. They tend to mash them together because in American history, more or less, these things all developed more or less, intermingled with one another. But analytically speaking, they are separate developments. They have separate histories. They have separate logics. And you can see historically cases where you have, for example, the first post-patrimonial state goes back to the 1800 BC. It was in China, the Mandarin system. China had a Weberian state, the first Weberian state in recorded history, but it did not have rule of law. It still doesn't have rule of law. China has never had a situation in which the ruler was above the law. The ruler gave the law. Whatever the ruler said was the law. As far as accountability, Not really. Now, on the other hand, let's look at the German princedoms before the development of the German state in 1870, 1871, which Dr. Maurer talked about. German principalities were known largely, and the early German state was known as a Rechtsstaat, a state of law, law state. The law was strong. The law was inherited from the Holy Roman Empire, from Charlemagne and before. When Germany then consolidated into a single state, it had a very, very strong executive, a very, very powerful Weberian post-patrimonial executive function. What about accountability? No, there wasn't any democratic, and there was hardly any substantive accountability in 19th century and early 20th century Germany, which is what led to German authoritarianism and ultimately the Nazi dictatorship. What about the point here is that these three functions are separate, and they sequence differently in different places. Now, some of you may have heard of a sort of an esoteric economic thinker named Alexander Gerschenkron. Alexander Gerschenkron had this theory. He created this term called path dependency. And to make a long story short, and it's very long, the order in which a modern polity acquires a Weberian state, rule of law, and some form of accountability, generally procedural accountability, it's the sequence. It's which comes first that determines regime type. Well, let me give you an example from the United States. The United States, we think of ourselves as best liberal democratic practice today. But the United States started out, all right, for historical reasons that all of you, I think, can put together very easily. The United States started out as a state with a strong rule of law tradition. It comes from the Anglo-Protestant tradition. It comes out of canon law, basically. And the United States, very early on, for reasons, again, I don't have to explain to you, had procedural accountability. Our democracy was not as, the suffrage was not as broad, of course, in 1789 as it became later on, but by then contemporary standards, the United States was a very broad democracy at the time. But what about the state? What about the Weberian state? We had a very weak state because the founders were very, very suspicious of central authority. We had a federal system that right away diminished the power of the federal state. But all through American history, really up until 1883, we did not have a Weberian state. We had an avalanche of clientelism. Clientelism being the sort of the aggregate notion of what patronage is. I mean, anybody who studies American history or studies the U.S. Post Office back in the day, you know how people got jobs. You know how this was the spoil system introduced by Andrew Jackson. All right, we did not have compared to Britain, compared to Germany, certainly compared to France, even compared to Spain. The American state was extremely feeble and extremely weak until 1883. It was in 1883 that the Pendleton Act was passed. All right, and we began to have a professional civil service. We were very, very late in the day forming a Weberian state. Okay, one could go across Europe, from northern Italy and southern Italy, which are different, to Greece, to Germany, all across the world, really. And if you look at these polities in terms of the sequence of their development, of executive authority in a post-patrimonial state, rule of law and the nature of the rule of law and constitutional law, and then the issue of accountability, you can essentially type every country in the world by looking at the sequence. Now, of course, many countries in the world haven't gotten through. They are not fully modern. They are not fully liberal. They are not fully democratic. But you can basically rank any polity in the world along this tripart taxonomy of what constitutes the elements of a modern democratic liberal state. Then reverse engineer what they lack to see why they are not at the level of best practice. Now, let's look at the Arabs. Now let's go back to the Arabs. Let's go, first of all, to the idea of a post-patrimonial state. How many Arab countries, so let's just assume, we'll include the Palestinians just because we want to be nice today. 22 countries. How many of them have anything like a Weberian state, a post-patrimonial state, where authority is impersonal and is not connected to family or tribe or clan or family? It's not a rhetorical question, but I'll give you the answer. The answer is approximately none of them. There are some exceptions. They're not all the same. Another thing Americans tend to mash up are Arabs. Every Arab country is different. Each one has a different history. They have a lot in common, of course. They have language, Islamic civilization as a background, but every one of these countries is different. Let's take Egypt. The idea of Egypt as a state goes back 4,000 years or more. Egypt is a relatively homogeneous country despite 6 million Copts. So Egypt has something of a post-tribal. Egypt is less tribal than many of the other societies in the region. Egypt it's patrimonial, but it's not tribal in the same way, for example, as Saudi Arabia or as Jordan or as Syria or as most of the other countries, Morocco. The military bureaucracy, to some extent, in Egypt, sort of substituted as a form of asabiyah, or affinity groups, for a literally tribal or family or clan-oriented association. But the state in general in the Middle East is weak. And the state is weak because the society is strong. Tribal society in particular is strong. If you don't understand tribal society and how it works, you won't have a clue to figuring out how the Middle East works. You'll never understand it. This is a semester's job, so I'm not going to try to explain it to you right now, but let's just take one element of it. After the Iraq War, a lot of American journalists descended on Baghdad after March 2003. Descended on Baghdad. And this one, I forget the guy's name. He was a New York Times reporter. He wrote this cover story in the paper. He was staying at this 5-star hotel. What used to be a 5-star hotel before the war in Baghdad. And he goes downstairs into the lobby, and he notices a huge celebration in the back of the hotel. In the lobby, there's a wedding going on, and the wedding is marrying 2 first cousins. Marrying first cousins. This surprises him. All right, so he goes and he tries to find somebody who can speak English. He goes and he talks to these people. There's a wonderful, beautiful quote in this article where he asks somebody, "How come these cousins are marrying?" And the guy says, "Well, we all marry our first cousins if we can. That's the ideal form of marriage." Of course, this is illegal in 37 states in the United States, right? So the reporter said, "Well, why do you do that?" And the answer is, "Well, if you can't trust your family, who can you trust?" All right. In Middle Eastern history. Obviously I'm simplifying. I mean, what choices have I got? The state was often weak. And so you needed, societies, communities, groups, families had to create some form of self-help. Marrying your cousin was essentially an alliance of parts of a Hams, a five-generation patriarchal system that kept you safe. If one part of a family got in trouble, they could call upon the other part to help them in the face of some adversary. And when you married your cousin, what you were doing also was you were creating larger land holdings. Larger land holdings, by creating marriage alliances, enabled you to be more prosperous, and enabled you to be more influential, and enabled you to raise self-defense capabilities and deterrent capabilities that a very weak state could not provide for you. Okay? And this is not just true of the Arab world. It's also true of many countries around the periphery of the Arab world, Afghanistan being one example. All right? But there are many, Pakistan, lots of examples. This tribal society, all right? Americans have a real hard time understanding how this works. They don't know what endogamous marriage means. And it's your job to teach your students what this is and why this matters. All right? So there was no post-patrimonial state. I mean, in the Gulf today, one author described them as families with flags. But these are not states, and they're certainly not nation states in the way that we tend to think of them in terms of Western parlance. Okay? And while I'm at it, here's something you definitely ought to teach your students if they don't already know it. Americans, again, we love conflations. We are just intellectually so happy with ourselves and so lazy most of the time. People use the word country, nation, state, and nation-state, little hyphen, as though they're synonyms, right? They're not, okay? One kid, I remember a kid when I was teaching at Penn, comes to me in the beginning of the school year and he says, "Professor, I had such a great time this summer. Man, I drove clear across the nation to California and back." And I said, "Man, you've just confessed to multiple vehicular homicide." He had no idea what I was talking about. A country is a physical place. A nation is a group of people who seem to have some affinity. A state is the governmental apparatus that rules the nation in the country. And a nation state, you saw Woodrow Wilson's ugly face up here before, a nation state is a normative concept anti-imperial concept, which basically says that nation and state should be coterminous, that Finns should rule Finns and Czechs should rule Czechs, and so on and so on and so forth. All right? I would venture to say that when students walk into your class, they don't have a clue how to define these four terms, and it's your job to get them to do it. Back to where I was. Rule of law. How about the second factor, rule of law? Were Arab states on the cusp of the so-called Arab Spring? Were they rule of law states? Did they have constitutional law? And again, the answer is, by and large, sort of, but no. The legal codes, the legal framework of all the Arab countries is a modeled affair, and it differs from place to place, differs sometimes dramatically from country to country. There is Sharia, there is Islamic law, but that's has usually been reserved in most of the countries for most of the post-independence period for family law, things that have to do with marriage and inheritance and divorce and stuff like that. Most of the Arab countries also adopted elements of Ottoman law from their 400 years as part of the Ottoman Empire. And as you heard from Dr. Reynolds, Ottoman law was not exclusively Sharia law. There were innovations and adaptations, and a lot of the Arab states, especially when it came to land titling, for example, inherited the Ottoman system of law. In addition, when the British and the French came after World War I, elements of Western law, especially torts, were also added to the so it was a real mishmash of legal arrangements. But how about constitutional law? Well, in the post-independence period, which I date from really roughly the middle 1940s on, there were lots and lots and lots and lots of constitutions promulgated in the Arab world. But were any of them real? I don't think you can find a single example where any leader truly felt obligated to behave according to the Constitution if his interests didn't suggest it. These were Potemkin village constitutions for the most part. Same with political parties. There were political parties in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, all over the Arab world. There were and there remain political parties. In Egypt, for example, after the 1952 overthrow of the monarchy, the free officers, Gamal Abdel Nasser, they promulgated constitutions, and they had a party called the Arab Socialist Union. But these parties were parties of the state. They were not independent, autonomous civil society creations. They were top-down creations of the state. They were used for patronage purposes. They were used for letting off steam, just as the press was used. The press was always an instrument of the state. There were never really genuine free. There were free presses, but there were red lines. You could say a lot of stuff, but if you started to say stuff beyond the red line, you were in serious trouble. These were muhabarat states, interior ministry states, police states, mostly a lot of the military states or monarchies with a strong muhabarat, secret service, police. There was not a genuine. There were very few genuine political parties. There were a couple. For example, the Communist Party in Syria and the Communist Party in Iraq. They were legitimate parties, and invariably, when they got too strong or when they crossed various red lines, they were slaughtered, as they were both in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere, and in Egypt. So there were no genuine constitutions that actually had traction on what leaders could and could not do, and there were no genuine political parties except at a very low level of existence. So rule of law, on the constitutional level, no. In society in general, yeah, there were law-like states, and a lot of the law, especially insofar as Sharia law was dominant, this came from indigenous sources of social authority, and so it was respected, and it worked fine. But at these higher, political level, and again, the more homogeneous the society tended to be, like Egypt or like Jordan, you tended to have less difficulty with this, and the more heterogeneous states, like Syria, like Iraq, in terms of tribal heterogeneity, like Libya, this became quite problematical. So you really had, in the heterogeneous states, you had a military dictatorship most of the time, often clothed in civilian uniforms, fake constitutions, fake political power, but these were military governments. The ultimate source of authority was the military. And in many cases, I mentioned Egypt, in many cases the military in these societies was the most modern institution in the state, and it was the only truly national institution in the heterogeneous states. The various clans, the various sectarian groups in society, each one vying to either protect itself or grab power at the national level. When the military was in power, it basically said, we are the strong horse. We are going to keep law and order, and we are going to try to give everybody a reasonably fair shake, but we're going to take our pound of flesh first. And, a lot of people didn't like it, but they kept order. There's a kind of a myth that the Middle East has always been a kind of an unstable place. On the eve of the Arab Spring, how unstable was the Middle East? How long had the Assad family been in power? Just starting 3 years ago, how long had the Assad power been in control of Syria? It goes back to November 1970. 1970, a lot of you weren't even born. Don't lie to me, I can tell. What about Libya? All right? Muammar Gaddafi shot himself into power on September 1st, 1969, even older. What about Egypt? Mubarak had been there since October 1981, Sadat before him, going back to September 1970, and Nasser from 1952. These were not unstable polities. These were extraordinarily stable. The stability of the graveyard, perhaps, not a lot of reform, but these were this was a stable part of the world. People mix up the Arab-Israeli business, which kicked forth several wars, with the rest of the region. When a lot of Americans hear Middle East, they think Arab-Israeli, so that's the whole thing. This goes from Morocco all the way to, this is not, the Arab-Israeli domain is not the Middle East, obviously. Now, what about accountability? Well, this is just as tricky. In homogeneous tribal societies, and even within heterogeneous societies that are dominated by tribe and clan, there is accountability. There's substantive accountability. Procedural accountability, in terms of what we understand by elections and majority rule, not really. But not all forms of accountability are procedural. As I said, some are substantive. So it isn't correct to say that if Arab countries before the Arab Spring did not have regular elections, that meant that they were tyrannies or that they were despotisms. Some of them were. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a tyranny. The Assads in Syria, pretty close. The Algerian generals, it depends on what year you're talking about. But you have to make distinctions. Just because none of these countries were democracies doesn't mean that they were all despotisms, all tyrannies, all evil, all horrible places. It's just not true. If you visited Jordan when King Hussein was alive back in the 1980s, it wasn't all flowers and chocolate, but people were not being dragged out of their houses at 3 o'clock in the morning by a bunch of undercover cops. That went on in Iraq, but it didn't go on in Jordan so much. Not at all, hardly. So there were huge differences here between the countries, but real accountability as we understand it, tribal accountability down deep in society, yes. Procedural accountability, no. And the elections did not confer accountability. Let me read you a quote from a former American diplomat named William Brown. He wrote a book back in the 1980s that nobody ever read, but it was a hell of a good book. And this is what he said. He said, according to liberal democratic norms of the West, political institutions are dedicated to enacting the wishes of a tolerant majority. In the Middle East, the purpose of political institutions is to facilitate the constant unfolding or revelation of a popular consensus. The Arab perceives a single community of faith and language that contrasts sharply with our emphasis on competing but mutually adjusting political factions. In the West, politics has a flavor of controlled conflict that the Arab regards as destructive to community. Close quote. In the development of Western political cultures, right, the opposite of authoritarianism is liberty. But in the Arab historical experience, the opposite of authoritarianism is chaos, which in Arabic is fitna, which has a couple of very interesting definitions I wish I had time to go into, but I don't. All right. Now, let me just explain again in more palpable terms just why the expectations, the default drive expectations, never materialized in the so-called Arab Spring and why they're not likely to. There are really three predicates for democratic political cultures. In America, we take this stuff for granted. We never even think about this stuff. But I'm asking you to think about it and relate it to what you know about the Arab world. First of all, it's necessary that people believe that political authority is intrinsic to the society. Of the people, by the people, for the people. You remember what Abe said, all right? As opposed to political authority being extrinsic to the society, meaning revealed by God. This makes a huge difference. If truth is plural, or can be plural, then you can imagine the idea of a loyal opposition. If truth can be plural, and if nobody can be said to have the word of God, in their shirt pocket, then the idea of debate can be healthy for a polity. If nobody can be absolutely certain by right of divine revelation what is true in political life, right, then it is possible anyway, that you can trust, if there's a constitution, if there's rule, you can trust a party in power to relinquish power if they should lose an election, right? It's not like betraying God or God's word if you lose an election, right? But if you live in a monadic religious society where there is one God and one truth and one regent, as it were, on earth, the caliph or lesser, then the whole idea of a loyal opposition is nonsensical. The whole idea of oscillations or changes in power, transfers of power, becomes a form of heresy. The idea of genuine tolerance, where you grant the possibility that you might be wrong and the other guy might be right, and you talk it out, and debate has a positive function in society, it just doesn't make any sense if you believe that there's only one truth and only one at a time, right? So that's the first thing. You need the source of authority has to be intrinsic to the society rather than extrinsic to it. A second thing you need to have in order to have real rule of law is you have to have the idea of basic equality. Now, of course, this has changed over time. But way back when back at the time of the Constitutional Convention, of course, we were only counting to vote propertied males, and they had to be Christians, right? We've expanded the franchise. But at least there was a group of people, a group of key political actors whose basic equality under the law was assumed, all right? In the Arab world, it is very difficult to go up to somebody, to a typical person, some 60-year-old person on the street in the village, and say, look, the vote of an educated qadi, a judge who has spent a long time studying, who is a literate person, who's from a good family, who is esteemed by the community, it's very difficult to make the case that person's vote is no better, worth no more than the vote of an illiterate woman from some minority who lives in a village in, often Pittsburgh province, right? They don't think like that. This idea of equality under the law, that everybody is essentially interchangeable under the law, this is an idea that's very hard to get across in these kinds of societies, all right? So the whole idea of equality, the idea of representation that we take for granted. Okay, we vote for a congressman, and the congressman represents, 80,000 people or 100,000 people, whatever. That's only possible if you assume that all 800,000 of these people are essentially equal. They're factotum. They're essentially equal. They're interchangeable, right? In traditional societies, not just Arab societies, people don't think like that. People have a lot of trouble aggregating individuals into huge clumps. So the very idea of representation, that one person could represent, 2,000 others, and they're assumed to be essentially interchangeable, that's just not the way it works. I mean, for example, in this country and in Western societies, equality before the law means if somebody is accused of a crime and they're brought before a judge, never mind the jury for a minute, let's assume we're in Europe, brought before a judge, the judge is supposed to apply the law equally to anyone standing in front of him in a court of law, regardless of personal circumstances. The judge in the continental system, of course, you want to know all the details of the case. It's not common law in Europe, but in the Arab world, it doesn't work like that at all. The judge tends to think that unless I know the circumstances of the person who is being accused of a crime and the circumstances of those who are accusing that person of a crime, unless I know their status in society, unless I know their economic situations, I can't possibly come up with a just verdict. So in other words, it's a highly personalized, highly individuated. We think of ourselves as individuals, but actually the way we actually operate, we conglomerate people and we do huge division problems. Arab society is highly individualistic, highly context dependent, highly circumstantial dependent. A judge would never imagine that he could do his job properly if he considered everybody equal. That would be insane, all right? Let's take the idea now, third, majority rule, elections, all right? We are used to the fact that if somebody wins 52% of the vote and the other guy wins 48% of the vote or 47% of the vote or whatever, that the guy who wins 52% of the vote gets all the power until the next election, whether it's 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, whatever it is, right? To a person in a traditional society, in a tribal society, this is absolutely insane, okay? This is not how they make decisions, not how they've ever made decisions. If I win 47% of the vote, my group, my ACBA, my affinity group, I win 7% of the vote, and you're telling me that for the next, I have no power, I have no say? Are you nuts? Is their reaction, right? Because they form decisions by a process of constant litigation, constant negotiation, by consensus, in Arabic, ijma, all right? So when you try to explain to an Iraqi, let's say, all right, well, we're going to have an election, right? And first past the post wins, and your guy, if you lose, you have nothing, all right? Until there's another election. Maybe there'll be another election, maybe there won't be, but you have nothing. And these guys go, oh yeah, democracy. Now I understand. You people are crazy. That's basically, I'm just trying to explain the differences here between things that Americans take completely for granted, never even reflect upon, okay, that just don't work. They don't translate into cultures with very different histories, different attitudinal predicates, different experiences, different social circumstances, all right? Now, what's going to happen now? I'm probably I should be running out of time even if I'm not. There's only one Arab country, I think, that has half a chance to develop a democratic outcome from all of this stuff. Oh, I forgot one thing. I forgot many things, and that's Tunisia. Tunisia has a fighting chance to make this work. Why was Mohammed Bouazizi irritated? Why did he light himself on fire? Why were most of those Egyptians out on the street? Not the twittering 20-something crowd. A lot of them understand democratic ideas, which wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago. There are real Democrats in the Arab world who really understand this stuff now. There have been a lot of social changes, so there is hope, that they'll figure their way. I mean, it used to be, for example, when there were mock elections held in Egypt, the sheikh or the qadi or the family elder would tell everybody how to vote in a block, and they would do it. Now, when the old guy goes out and tells all the young people how to vote, they say, "Go mind your own business, you old fart. We're going to do what we want." All right? Individual agency is spreading. The communal bonds are showing signs of cracking in many of these societies, which is either healthy or unhealthy depending on your point of view. But there are changes. There are things that are going on. But really, what people were irritated about in almost all of these countries, and they took to the street, wasn't the lack of democracy. Did Mohammed Bouazizi go out and burn himself and protest because there wasn't a liberal democracy in Tunisia? No. Did he go out and burn himself and try to start, a revolution because he was concerned about the absence of minority rights in Tunisia? No. Why did he do it? He did it because of the fact that the ruling elite in Tunisia, as in Egypt, as in Syria, as in Iraq before, as in Libya, as in every one of these countries, the ruling elite is associated with families, with clans, with families they've married into, and they translate this into economic advantage, licensing restrictions, huge barriers to entry for any business. Bouazizi had a fruit stand, right? The cops come along, they beat him up, they take his fruit stand, they take his fruit, they smash the stuff, and he's screwed, okay? His business was illegal, right? Just about every startup business in the Arab world is illegal unless you pay somebody off to make it legal. In other words, you've got beneath the rulers themselves, and in the case of Egypt, the Egyptian military bureaucracy has its hand in every economically lucrative aspect in the whole country. They refer to it as their pension fund. They have a great sense of humor in Egypt. You cannot do business legally in most of these countries unless you pay somebody off, unless you put yourself in their debt. Okay? It's like the company store in a big way. You have a huge rentier elite in the economy right below the political power. The best example of this is in Syria, where you can't do business at all unless you are obedient to the regime. Okay? That's what they're angry at. They want to be able to start a business legally. Right? They're also angry at the fact that every time the cop comes by, the cop either beats him on the head or drags him into the jail, and you got to bribe the cop. You didn't do anything. You got to bribe the cop to get out of jail. Their dignity has been assaulted. Their economic freedom has been extinguished. That's what they're mad about. They're not mad about that they can't go and vote for, Ahmed blah, whatever it is. They don't give a damn. All right? That's why they're out on the street. Not a democracy movement. Now, what's going to happen? As I say, we know it's going to happen in Egypt. It's either the same thing all over again, or it's the same, or it's the one damn thing after another, depending on however you like that phrase. But Tunisia has a chance. Why does Tunisia have a chance? Again, the only way to know this is to go back into the history. And here's some pretty esoteric history, and I'll just wind up with this. In order to understand why Tunisia has a chance and the others don't, in my view, at least not for a while, generational thing, is the shashia. What is a shashia? Anybody? I'd be shocked if anybody. A shashia is a hat. Okay, it's that dark red wool hat that's kind of a circle that has a little tassel on top, usually a brown tassel. Right? A shashia is the headgear that any pasha, any gentleman wore during most of Ottoman times. And they were manufactured overwhelmingly in Tunis. It was a guild. It was a very guild-like structure. They were manufactured. Now, what's this got to do with democracy? Well, in order to get the wool to make the shashiyas, the Bey of Tunis, and I'm talking about a person, not a body of water, the B-E-Y, the Bey, developed commercial relationships with Europe. They used to get the wool from the Netherlands, Germany, France. So back in the 1600s even, 1700s, Tunis had was a kind of a merchant state that had lots of relationships with Europe that even other North African countries didn't have. Certainly, most other countries in the Middle East lacked. They developed a kind of a commercial culture that was unusual in the region in general, and they developed a very cosmopolitan, pragmatic attitude toward dealing with Europeans. And they learned a little bit of modern medicine, a little bit of modern finance. They were advanced because they were in trading relations with more advanced societies. The other reason why Tunisia has a chance is Habib Bourguiba. Habib Bourguiba was the father of modern Tunisia, and Bourguiba was an unusual guy. He was an authoritarian. He was, however, a francophone, and he also had a different attitude toward women than most of his contemporaries and most other people. He was for female education. He was for women being in the workforce. He had a very strong wife who probably had a lot to do with this. So if you looked at the Middle East right on the cusp of the Arab Spring, what you would find is that in many Arab countries, women could go out in public with veiled or not veiled. In many Arab countries, Saudi Arabia being, of course, one, it was illegal. It's still illegal for women to go outside without her face covered one way or another. Tunisia was the only country in the Arab world where it was illegal to veil. Women were not allowed to veil in Tunisia under Bourguiba. So because of the commercial relationship long-standing with Europe, and because of the power of his personality, Tunisia is socially more advanced in many respects, though not all, than just about all the other Arab countries. And for that reason, and it's also a small population. It's an urban population largely concentrated in Tunis, like a city-state. For a variety of reasons, the Tunisians have a chance. They have a chance. The others, no, I don't think so. I'd be willing to bet on it, actually, no. So just remember, our way of doing things, or the Western way, did not fall out of the sky. It is part of our organic historical experience. And for us to turn this experience into a myth, assume that it's universal, and to project its frames of references onto other people with very different experiences and very different attitudinal components is not a good thing. So if you teach your students just one thing about the Middle East, it is, in order to understand others, you had better have a better understanding of yourself. Okay? And be careful not to project what you know about yourself unthinkingly onto others. Thank you.
Ready for questions?
Yeah, how much time have we got? What did I do here?
15 minutes.
Oh, that's not bad.
Well, hoping for a half hour.
Yeah.
Excellent presentation, Bill Toppich from Pulaski Academy. I was wondering what role the middle class will play in potential change. Do you see this being having opportunity to alter the situation at all?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, that gets to the point I just made recently about economic opportunity, about barriers to entry for business, about the rentier classes in these countries that prevent. There aren't thriving middle classes in most of these countries. You have a huge skewed socioeconomic situation in most of these places. You have a very, very wealthy elite, usually connected to the regime. Again, I'm generalizing. I mean, you have to. The 22 countries. For me to explain each country separately, I'd be here until February or something. But generally speaking, middle classes are very weak in these societies. They're not weak. They haven't been historically weak, for example, in Iran. Now, Iran is not an Arab country, which I'd be prepared to bet that most of the students who enter your classes don't know. Most Americans think that Iran is an Arab country because they don't know the difference between an ethno-linguistic term and a sectarian term. So all Arabs are Muslims and all Muslims are, and that's what people think in America, basically. Our learning curve about this part of the world since 9/11, as best I can tell, has been completely flat. All right? If one guy, some journalist went and he asked a bunch of pretty senior people in government to explain to him the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. None of them knew, not one. And some of the answers that they produced, guessing, were horrifying in terms of their ignorance. So we don't really know much about this part. They don't have big middle classes, and Iran is not an Arab country. And until they have, well, I mean, this is, social science doesn't know very much for sure. But one of the things social scientists think they know is that once you get a middle class, once you have per capita GDP above a certain number, and it spreads out pretty much, then you get pressure. The people have a vested interest in governance at that point, and then you get pressure to have your voice heard, and that's when you start militating for some kind of representational or pluralistic political institutions. Well, that really hasn't happened. What's really interesting about the so-called Arab Spring is that Arabs have traditionally been very passive politically. Revolutions from society up, all right, are almost non-existent. You have a lot of coups. Here and there, you have a turmoil at the top among the elite, but the kind of the bubbling turmoil from below, like you've seen in Iran historically, 1905 later, the Arabs have not typically done that. Now they have. It says this is new business, all right, this new thing, and I think a lot of this has to do with some of the technologies that are knitting people together in ways that they didn't before. It's no coincidence that the first people that were in Meydan al-Tahrir and Tahrir Square in Cairo were, again, the twittering 20-somethings and 30-somethings, the ones that are facile with modern technology, or what I call tech-novelty, political tech-novelty, right? So things are changing, and we will see. But really, until you can break the block of these rentier classes over the economy, until you can lower barriers to entry, you're not going to get big middle classes, and then you're not going to get the pressure to widen the political circle. Won't happen.
Is it on now? I wonder if I could ask you to shift gears a little bit, and I'll put out a proposition to you, and then I'd love to hear you think about it or refute it. And it would be this. Suppose I accept all you said, but then I say, looking at us, that we are the people of democracy. That's who we are. That is so deep in our national character that we cannot project force abroad if it isn't somehow connected to our ideals. So even if you're right about the Middle East, the United States still has to be the party that tries to spread democracy and or at least greater liberty in the world. And I'd just like to hear you respond to that.
Well, this of course is not the first time the question's been asked, either of me or of a lot of other people. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of you will remember, I think, that back in 1991, when the first Gulf War took place, and the United States liberated Kuwait from an Iraqi occupation. Very soon, after this wasn't even over yet, people began to discuss this war as a failure because Kuwait wasn't a democracy. Kuwait didn't become a democracy after the war was over. But if you go back and you actually look through the statements of all of the senior officials in the Bush 41 administration, okay, and what the rationale was for expelling Iraq from the Iraqi military from Kuwait, not the president, not the Secretary of State, not the Secretary of Defense, nobody justified the war on the basis of bringing democracy to Kuwait. Nobody. And yet they were criticized afterwards for not bringing democracy to Kuwait. And Kuwait at that point, with the Al Sabah family and the emir, would sooner turn into a democracy than I would put on a red tutu and go flying through the sky looking like Cinderella. It just wasn't going to happen. But that just proves the point that whenever we spend blood and treasure abroad, or at least when we put our soldiers in harm's way, the default drive of the American mind is it has to result in some kind of democratic outcome. That's what we do. That's who we are. That's right. And I think it's also right to say that democracy promotion, or if not democracy, then human rights promotion, not the same thing, is part of our makeup, and it's always been part of our foreign policy to one extent or another, and it probably always will be. And I'm glad of it. It's a myth, but it's my myth. It's a myth I choose. I like it, and that's just the way we are. And you can't mobilize the American people to do anything, really. Sometimes you can't mobilize them even with a democratic predicate associated with a policy, but you can't get people to spend blood and treasure, put soldiers in harm's way for old-fashioned European-style realpolitik objectives. It just doesn't happen in this country. Henry Kissinger learned that the hard way. Having said all that, let me quote a great American philosopher, the Wicked Witch of the East, who said, "These things must be done delicately." You remember the movie, right? There are smart ways and there are stupid ways to do these kinds of things. And without starting another lecture, let me just say that imposing democratic norms on people, lecturing them as though we are the mother-in-law of the world, tends to be counterproductive. It doesn't work. Moreover, let me make the point that many, if not most, Middle Eastern countries, and not just Middle Eastern countries, are struggling with coming to terms with modernity. And we go back to 1799 in Egypt as for the date that punctuates this collision. And typically what has happened, again, not just among the Arab countries, is that society tends to break down into three identifiable parts whenever this kind of extrinsic pressure comes down upon them. There are people who say, hey, these guys in the West, these guys who like democracy and human rights and capitalism, they're strong and they're powerful, let's be like them. And they say, let's just abandon our traditional ways, let's abandon the traditional corporate identifications that we've had for centuries and centuries and eons, and let's become like them. And there have been people like that, Then there's a group that says, these are the reformers who say, let's take what we can from them, but let's not violate our own cultural integrity. Let's not put at risk our corporate identity. We'll take the technology and the good stuff, but we won't take the Westernization stuff. We'll just borrow. We'll pick and choose what we want. But then there's always a group, pretty much always a group, that says, no, these people are evil. They are an assault to our corporate identity. They're trying to extinguish us. And they almost always mobilize religious symbols of one kind or another to fend off the threat. And that's what radicals, that fits Al-Qaeda perfectly. But it doesn't just fit Al-Qaeda. I mean, this kind of stuff has gone on in every continent, in every culture. You have the Taiping Rebellion in China. You have the Peasants' Revolt in Europe in the 1600s. You have the ghost dances of American Indians in the 19th century. There are lots of examples of what happens when modernity pounds on a culture that's just not quite riding the bike without the training wheels yet, right? So sometimes if you overdo it, you play directly into the hands of the worst elements in these cultures. You say, well, the Americans want us to do this, and the Americans want us to do that, but they're trying to make us Christians. They're trying to make us false to our religion, okay? And that helps the bad guys. So there are dumb ways to do this. In particular, the pounding that we do through the State Department and USAID on gender equality, all right? That's the one thing that a lot of Americans think we have right. We have gender equality, all right? And I like women. I have a wife, I have a daughter, I have a I'm crazy about women. But when you make this the point of your spear in lecturing Middle Eastern cultures, all right, lecturing tribal, hierarchical, patriarchal societies, you are playing right into the hands of the worst elements in those cultures. Now, if people in those societies want to do these things, if they want a free press, if they want a judiciary that's not tainted, if they want gender equality, if they want education for women, we ought to help them with open arms. We ought to be there for them. And other democratic states ought to be there, but they have to ask. Because if it looks like it's our idea, and it looks like we're trying to impose it, and again, if we come on lecturing them like the mother-in-law of the world, this is oftentimes counterproductive. So yes, we should do these things. Yes, that has to be part of our foreign policy, but we should do it the smart way instead of the stupid way. That's really about all I got to say about that. Somebody should ask me about Jordan.
Hello. I'm not actually going to ask you about Jordan. I'm sorry.
Oh, shucks.
But I'm actually going to ask you my question through the lens of my students when I teach them this.
Yeah.
They want to force me into talking about religion because for them, it's all about Islam. Like the Arab Spring is Islam. And so how would you approach teaching it so that they're getting a really well-educated view? The region that I teach in Fredericksburg, Virginia, most of my students are in military families. And so most of their families have some sort of recent connection to the Middle East.
Well, look, American foreign policy is, for the most part, at least during certain parts of what I call the McDougall cycle of American foreign policy, and I owe this all to Walter, when the exceptionalist narrative turns into times of high emotion in the United States, foreign policy turns into a passion play, a secularized version of a passion play. The late Michael Kelly defined American foreign policy in this phase perfectly. He said it is secular evangelism, armed. Okay. Since we are essentially taking a religious or a doctrinal attitude, of course it's in drag, we think it's secular, but it isn't. We just change the proper nouns and think it's not religious, but it is. When we come across that way, it's quite natural that we project the whole religious framework onto the other side. And it's certainly true. In terms of Al-Qaeda, for example, they're religious people. In their own way, they think they're religious people. So there's a religious element to it, of course. But if you were to teach normal political sociology, comparative politics, to anybody, religion would be one factor out of a whole range of factors. There would be the economy and the labor profile. There would be ethnic heterogeneity, ethnic differences. There would be a whole range of factors that, I mean, if you were going to describe American society is not defined by just religious affiliation. Well, it's the same in these countries, okay? So I think the way you help students understand other parts of the world is get them to have a firm grasp on our part of the world, all right? If you can take what is most familiar to them and say, look, there are a range of variables that go into describing social and political reality in the United States. Now let's look at another part of the world. Let's be very careful how we do it because you don't have a direct isomorphism between the way we do things. But let's consider all of these factors. If you start that way, then maybe you can get them to realize that religion is a part of the answer, but not the whole of it.
So, Adam, we have less than 3 minutes left. So, tell me something unique about Jordan.
Well, no, actually, what I wanted somebody to say, what I wanted somebody to ask, was like, where do these countries come from? All right. Well, Professor Maurer gave you a good idea, and Professor Reynolds before him gave you a good idea that the Ottoman Empire from Selim I in 1517, and then consolidated by Suleiman the Magnificent in later years. The Ottoman Empire ruled this part of the world for almost all of it, certainly the Levant, for 400 years. And it wasn't until World War I that, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, that these places had borders, acquired borders, and became states. And then after the British and French mandate period, they became independent countries. Some of them didn't become independent countries in the Gulf until after 1971. All right, and the origins, for example, of the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, for example, are quite interesting. So again, there's a lot of diversity in describing how the state system came into being. But basically, it goes like this: the British and the French divided up the area between them. They started to do it in the Sykes-Picot arrangement, secret arrangement in 1916, which was made public by the Bolshevik government. Getting from 1916 to actually how the borders got drawn after World War I is a complicated story. It depends a lot on where General Allenby and his troops ended up. It depended on a variety of things. As Professor Maurer said, the British Exchequer was broke at the end of World War I and tried to find economical ways to manage all of this real estate that came into its possession. And one of the ways that they did this was they tried to find local sources of authority, local rulers that the British could prop up with a couple of military advisors and a gold subsidy so that the British Army wouldn't have to do it directly. Much cheaper that way. A little riskier, but the French tried to do the same thing. The French were experts at divide et impera, divide and rule. Lebanon and Syria are excellent examples of how the French tried to go about that. But basically, the essence of it is that the British, after the British model, created a series of relatively stable, well-governed monarchies, and the French, true to the French, created a series of highly unstable, almost disastrous republics. All right, that's pretty much what happened in the period thereafter. Now, Jordan, but the point is that some of these countries go back, had historical roots. Egypt, certainly. Iraq, certainly. Despite having been cobbled together from 3 separate provinces of the Ottoman Empire, there was an idea of Mesopotamia, an idea of Iraq, going all the way back to the Abbasid dynasty. All right, that was the capital of the Abbasid dynasty. Was Baghdad. So some of these places cohered as units in the minds of their subjects, but others were totally artificial. And Jordan is the most artificial of them all. And I'll just really quickly do this. You saw a photograph Professor Maurer put on the screen of the Cairo Conference, okay, in 1920. And he didn't mention it, but the little guy with the beard and the little guy was a guy named Abdallah. That was the Emir Abdallah. Now, here's what happened. In addition to trying to get the Jews on their side in World War I, and one of the reasons was there were a lot of Jews in Europe and a lot of Jews in Germany. And the British thought that the Jews would rise up and they could be a fifth column against the Germans. That didn't pan out. The Jews in Germany were pretty loyal to the German state. But the idea was just to create trouble for the Axis powers. But they also tried to get the Arabs to undermine the Turks. That's what the Arab revolt was all about. That's what T. E. Lawrence was all about. Try to get the Arabs to hurt the Turks and divert their forces. And it worked. It worked to some degree. And the British promised the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein in Mecca, that after the war, the Hashemites, the Hashemite family, would get an independent Arab state. And if you look at the actual map of Sykes-Picot, there's a map. You look at it in the British archives. You will see on the map. I wish I had it, but I wasn't planning to talk about this. You will see it says independent Arab state. It's written on the map, independent Arab state. So the idea that the Sykes-Picot agreement was just eyewash and that the Allies never made any sincere promises to the Arabs is simply wrong. The promises were sincere. They weren't kept exactly because the British and the French ran into each other, arguing with each other about the spoils after the guns fell silent in General Allenby's army. So what happened was this. So Hussein had 3 sons. The eldest son was Ali. The middle son was Abdallah. I hope I don't get this wrong. And the youngest son was Faisal. So what did the British do? They left Ali to be king of the Hejaz, and Ali remained king of the Hejaz until 1924, when the armies of Ibn Saud came in and took over Mecca and Medina, and he went into exile to Egypt. Meanwhile, Abdallah and Faisal especially, Faisal was a more military guy, he had been with T.E. Lawrence. Did you guys see the movie, Lawrence of Arabia? It's halfway accurate, actually, some of it. He fought with T.E. Lawrence along the lines of the Hejaz Railroad, which basically parallels the Jordanian River on the east side of the river. And they blew up trains and they caused a lot of damage. So they wanted to reward Faisal. So what did they do? They made Faisal king of Syria. And they put him on a throne in Damascus. And the French went, whoa, look at the map that says Alphonse. What is that guy doing there? They thought that the British putting Faisal in Damascus was a way to cheat the French out of their share of the spoils. Okay? Which, of course, it kind of was. But what happened was there was the French basically mobilized an army, and they kicked Faisal out of Damascus. It was a battle near Daraa, near the train station, near the current-day Jordanian. So what did Churchill do? Churchill, he not only did he go, he went to Jerusalem, and as it was said, over cigars and brandy, one Sunday, he created Transjordan. It was like a 3-way trade in baseball. Here's what he did. He took Faisal, okay, and he made him king of Iraq. That's the beginning of the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq, which lasted until July 28, 1958, okay? And he took Abdallah and he created the Emirate of Transjordan, stuck him in Amman, gave him Sir John Bagot Glubb Pasha, and a gold subsidy. Jordan. Jordan was created, however, with a purpose. It was meant to be both a north-south and an east-west buffer. It was meant to be a dividing piece of geography between Syria and Saudi Arabia and between Iraq and Palestine. And that is what it has been ever since, and it's damned important that it stay there and be that. Because if Jordan were to disintegrate, all hell would... You think all hell's broken loose already? Just you wait. Last point. I promise I'll stop. What are we looking to? If the Arab Spring is not going to succeed in creating stable liberal democracies in the Middle East, and it ain't, what is the real consequence of all of this tumult? The real consequence of it is that the origins of the Arab state system in Sykes-Picot are coming undone. Not just the state system, folks, but the states themselves. Syria no longer exists. Even if Assad were to fall, or even if the rebels were to win militarily, it's hard to imagine that one could put back together again the Syrian state. I'm quite confident that this is very likely to happen in Iraq as well. American foreign policy is Westphalian. We like to deal with states. We think of international relations as relations among states. What are we going to do if two major countries in the Levant and in Southwest Asia, Iraq and Syria, and possibly others, stop being states and start looking like the mess of local rivalries that existed between the time of the rescission of the Mongol armies and the arrival of the Ottoman Turks? What are we going to do with an area like that? Right? That's what the Arab Spring has led to. It has shattered the state system that began under Sykes-Picot, and it will leave us with something completely something we haven't seen in this part of the world for about 500, 600 years.
Thank you very much, Adam.